So the gag at the start of part 1 for this rule, which is set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, I jokingly reference my optimism at being able to get through this chapter quickly because it's short, versus the reality of just how much there was I wanted to expand and dive into with the chapter. After writing out the script for the rest of the chapter, there's even more to say. And if this video shows up in the Peterson subreddit again, hi, all you little lobsters, again, I will not apologize for or change the color of my words if it offends you, and I would suggest that you watch more than the first 10-15 seconds of one of these videos before making your judgments about me and my flash and posturing. I mean, I've got links and timestamps and everything in the description box, so you can just skip straight to Peterson's arguments if you want. Welcome back! And everybody who's here from Curio's channel, hi, welcome, make yourself at home. My assistant hasn't used her cubby in a little bit, so you're welcome to try and squeeze in there. It's got a cushion and everything. Might be cozy. For the new peeps, I am Eris, although I suppose that's kind of obvious in retrospect, and I have a cognitive psychology PhD. Cognitive psychology, we focus on thought processes and knowledge. So this includes things like attention, language, decision-making, learning, memory, blah, 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 blah. This is a separate field within psychology from things like counseling or clinical psychology, which is Jordan B. Peterson's wheelhouse. Before getting into the heavy stuff, I will do the channel business now. Like, if you enjoy this type of edutainment, perhaps even subscribe. I'm back to a 50-50 split between subscribed and not, so if you enjoy this, just click the little subscribe guy and make my day. Don't worry about the bell. I mean, I never ring anybody's bell. Push notifications? Pfft. And you can hit me up on Twitter, Discord, in the comment section. If you enjoy this content, maybe even support me on Patreon. Help me feed my little assistant here. Yeah? Link in description. And now for the heavy stuff. In this section, Peterson continues to quote the mass doers of harm to illustrate how nihilistic their mindset is. And I want to remind you that Peterson quoted Tolstoy in the previous section about 4 responses you could have to the meaninglessness and evilness of life. So 1 is to just be blissfully unaware of all of that stuff. The second option is to just embrace hedonism and make the knowledge go away somehow. The third option is sort of the coward's way out, and that's to just continue on in the face of that knowledge that life is meaningless and evil. And fourth is the courageous, strong response to this knowledge, and that's to end it. I really want to remind you that Peterson said that Tolstoy wasn't pessimistic enough in his analysis, since the joke of life motivates murder, not just internal murder. Trying to tap dance around the ear. Finally, a quick refresher on the visual shorthand I use in this video. This indicates the Peterson stuff. This is for my thoughts or responses to Peterson. And this is for experiment-related stuff. Alrighty, let's see if Peterson can turn around that angry downward spiral from part 1 in this section. This section starts with people of differing beliefs, specifically Judeo-Christian or atheist-agnostic, struggling with the question of, why is there so much suffering and cruelty? Peterson says that maybe suffering is God or even chance's fault, but the consequence of believing that. But what happens if you do? Mass murderers believe that the suffering attendant upon existence justifies judgment and revenge, as the Columbine boys so clearly indicated. Before further quoting of one of the boys, further illustrating the revenge aspect. He also includes the example of a man from Minnesota who committed crimes of varying severity, all bad, to express his outrage at being, and that's with a capital B. He acted as if someone was responsible. Peterson then goes back to Cain and Abel, saying that Cain wanted to get revenge against God and so killed Abel. I'm not entirely sure how a sacrifice being rejected by a deity leading to the murder of one's brother is equivalent to a childhood full of heinous acts being committed against a person, leading to a very long list of horrible acts committed against a large number of people. Peterson says that the Cain and Abel story represents the truest version of extreme vengeance. How about the time God smited most of the human population because they displeased him? That's pretty extreme, and against a whole bunch of beings. Or the time God destroyed a couple cities because of the sketchy things going on there. Also pretty extreme. And besides, the Lord is a jealous and vengeful God. The Lord is vengeful and strong in wrath. The Lord is vengeful against his foes. He rages against his enemies. Who can stand before his indignation? Who can confront the heat of his fury? His wrath pours out like fire. The rocks are shattered because of him. With a rushing flood, he will utterly destroy her place and pursue his enemies into darkness. Killing one guy kind of pales in comparison against wiping a couple cities and everyone in them off the face of the earth. Although I imagine somebody into apologetics would say that God's vengeance is perfect and good, or something along those lines. A question I've had through most of this chapter is, what do extreme vengeance and mass murder have to do with getting your life together? This quote, presented in its entirety. The man from Minnesota's response was, and this is what was so terrible, perfectly understandable. The details of his autobiography reveal that he was one of Tolstoy's strong and logically consistent people. He was a powerful, consistent, fearless actor. He had the courage of his convictions. How could someone like him be expected to forgive and forget, given what had happened to him? Truly terrible things happen to people. It's no wonder they're out for revenge. Under such conditions, vengeance seems like a moral necessity. How can it be distinguished from the demand for justice? After the experience of terrible atrocity, isn't forgiveness just cowardice or lack of willpower? Such questions torment me. But people emerge from terrible pasts to do good and not evil, although such an accomplishment can seem superhuman. This paragraph worries me. There's understanding how somebody ended up going over the edge, and then there's writing fanfic about school shooters. I hope that Peterson was trying to appeal to our darker natures in this paragraph, the parts that would like revenge for wrongs. But the strong, positive adjectives used to describe the Minnesota man, the equating of forgiveness with cowardice or being weak-willed, toxic masculinity at best. Vengeance can be distinguished from justice. Justice is supposed to be impartial and out of the hands of the one who would want revenge, the one who was wronged. Bam! Distinguished. Peterson gives examples of people who had horrible upbringings but were able to grow up and lead positive lives. He starts with somebody who grew up in the Canadian residential schools for Indigenous kids. If you aren't familiar, it's not just the US who has a historical and ongoing problem with the people who were here first. These residential schools removed Indigenous children from their families to help them integrate with Canadian culture better. They emphasize losing their family's language, traditions, and culture. These schools are also notorious for exposing the children to inadequate resources, including food, as well as physical and sexual abuse. The last of these schools closed in 1996. Peterson describes knowing this man and said that he had horrible experiences in these residential schools, which led him to substance abuse and other self-destructive behaviors. And Peterson points out that this guy had similar experiences in his childhood to the Minnesota man. He detested everyone, God, himself, and blind fate included. But he put an end to all of that. He stopped drinking, he stopped hating, although it still emerges in flashes. He did a lot of good culturally. He decided to be a good person, and then did the impossible things required to live that way. Why this man decided to change his life's trajectory? is not included. Way to sell the ability to change our lives for the better, Peterson. Impossible? Unintentional autobiography strikes again. The other was a client of Peterson's, and she had a horrible upbringing, but she didn't engage in the same behaviors that her guardians had done with her. And this ending the cycle of abuse is noted as being possible by Peterson, not because we have the conscious ability to sort of change how we behave, but because Nietzsche said so. He quotes Nietzsche to argue that people who go through bad situations can choose to propagate the bad or instead choose to do good.
Someone tormented by her mother can learn from her terrible experiences how important it is to be a good parent. Many, perhaps even most, of the adults who abuse children were abused themselves as children. However, the majority of people who were abused as children do not abuse their own children. This is a well-established fact. Abuse disappears across generations. People contain its spread. That's a testament to the genuine dominance of good over evil in the human heart.
Remember, dear viewer, that a citation needed flag doesn't automatically mean that I disagree with Peterson, just that he needs to support his claims. Well, this is awkward, given our difference of opinion for corporal punishment in the last chapter. And the UN and the American Pediatric Association all saying that corporal punishment is a form of physical abuse. Seems like Peterson isn't really helping the cause of making abuse disappear here. Personal example. My dad was an example of someone not wanting to perpetuate the abuse cycle. As I've talked about elsewhere on this channel, my dad was physically abused by his father, and he swore up and down that he would never do that to his children. And it went so far as he wouldn't even curse in front of me or my mom. Except for the one time I stayed home sick from school, and so he was running late to work because of that, and kind of rushing out the door, he dropped his briefcase on his foot, which caused it to pop open and cause all the stuff inside to just go everywhere and hurt him, and that earned a shit. But I don't think he realized I was awake to hear it. So, anyways, his parenting style was very authoritative. I know it sounds horrifying, but that's the parenting style that is ideal to go with, according to research. He was very patient and kind and gentle and wanted me to understand why I shouldn't be doing certain behaviors or should be doing other behaviors. Bottom line here is that people can absolutely break this cycle of abuse, and my dad did not want me to be raised the same way that he'd been raised. Just Peterson and I kind of differ on this whole hitting your kids thing.
The desire for vengeance, however justified, also bars the way to other productive thoughts.
Peterson's example here is a play called The Cocktail Party by one T.S. Eliot. Trivia! Same guy that's somewhat responsible for Cats. T.S. Eliot wrote a series of poems that was turned into the Cats musical. He says that one character in the play hopes that she is at the fault for her life's suffering because then she can do something about it. If it's God's fault, she's powerless to do anything about it. In part 1 for this rule, one of the papers we went through explored this idea. The authors of that paper made the distinction between the cause, responsibility, and blame for an event. The cause is what sets an event in motion. Responsibility is sort of like the intent behind setting that event in motion. So somebody could fully intend for something bad to happen, or it might just be an accident. Finally, the blame is sort of like the culpability for that whatever happening. And this is judged either by the person who set the event in motion or by other people. And so in this story, that character seems to be wanting to be the cause for her problems. It's also noted that the best coping post-event comes from a person who's able to accept their role as the cause in that event, but less beneficial coping comes from accepting the responsibility or the blame for the event. And so this character, if she can accept her role as the cause for her suffering and not some exogenous source like God, she has a better chance of being able to cope with her suffering. What's killing me here is that Peterson could have supported this by referencing this paper or other papers like it, but he doesn't. And I get that a play and a character in a play is a bit more relatable to a layperson audience than some stuffy academic paper, but he could have still worked a reference in by saying something like, this character's intuition about wanting to be the cause of her suffering is supported by blah, 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 but he doesn't. And we're back to talking about people overcoming bad life situations in a positive way. And I apologize in advance for how bad I'm probably going to slaughter this guy's name, but Alexander Solzhenitsyn gets the rest of the section devoted to him. And while looking up this person and fact-checking him, I found out that Alexander actually got a Nobel Prize in Literature. This is something that Peterson just forgot to mention. Solzhenitsyn had been a Russian soldier against the Nazis, spent time in a gulag, and while in there, got cancer. Peterson says that
Solzhenitsyn had cause to curse God. Job himself barely had it as hard.
Putting aside that Job is a story, really, Peterson? I'm not putting down Solzhenitsyn's experience here, that was awful, but he got off light compared to Job. Quick and dirty version of Job, if you're not familiar. Satan and God were talking, as they do, and Satan made the case that Job was only being a good godly man because God had been so good to him. So God was like, nuh-uh, and smote him hard. Wife, kids, house, crops, livestock, all obliterated. And despite all of this, Job perseveres despite not really understanding what's going on. God appears before him, is like, look, bitch, I'm God, you're not. Job is like, yep, you are. God gives him new stuff. Old family is still dead, but I guess he didn't like them that much anyways. Peterson says that Solzhenitsyn opened his eyes and looked around in the gulag at everybody who still had a positive outlook on life. And at some point, he started to question if he had personally contributed to the catastrophe of his life.
How had he missed the mark in the past? How many times had he acted against his own conscience, engaging in actions that he knew to be wrong? How many times had he betrayed himself and lied? Was there any way that the sins of his past could be rectified, atoned for, in the muddy hell of a Soviet gulag?
Recall, dear viewer, that Peterson's definition of sin is missing the mark. I am all for making the best of a bad situation, but this idea that he needs to make up for past sins, especially in a gulag, is just rustling my jimmies. Now, you absolutely should take advantage of a situation like this, where you have a ton of time on your hands and you're not going anywhere, to make a better version of yourself. Prison to me is a rehabilitative process, although gulags aren't prison, but anyways. But this idea that he can make up for sins he committed in the military just doesn't make sense. I'm going to bring back another paper that we talked about in part 1 because it is incredibly relevant here. Quick recap. The Park and Folkman paper argued for a distinction between a person's global and situational meaning. Global meaning includes a person's beliefs, values, and goals. Situational meaning is what happens when the person's global meaning interacts with things that happen to them, including, and especially, negative events. So when a bad thing happens, they say that first we figure out how personally impacted we are by this bad thing, and then we figure out what to do, what actions to take in moving forward. And they say that how much control we feel over the situation, both in the bad event itself and moving forward, can impact how negative we perceive this event to be. The more control we feel we have, the less negative this event is. But we can also yank control back from the environment by basically shifting our perspective. The example they give in the paper is a cancer diagnosis. Once you've got the cancer diagnosis, there's about fuck all you can do for the cancer itself. But you can take some control back in feeling proactive in your treatment and doing lifestyle changes to try to be healthier and get through it. There are several parts in this paper that stuck out to me as particularly relevant to Solzhenitsyn's story. First is an idea that people may have exaggerated perceptions of control. While one doesn't typically find themselves in a Soviet gulag without having done something to have pissed off the state. This idea that Solzhenitsyn tried to figure out how he had personally contributed to the catastrophe of his life does mesh with this idea that he might overestimate the degree of control he has over finding himself in that gulag. The second thing is related to the what to do now phase of trying to deal with a negative life event. As noted earlier, people who have some perception of control over things have better coping versus those who don't feel the sense of control. So even though I'm kind of questioning how much direct control Solzhenitsyn had in finding himself in that gulag, that perception of control over ending up there might have actually helped him with coping with that. Finally, the paper notes that traumatic events, like being thrown in a gulag, can violate the sense of control we have over our lives. As with the cancer example, we can try to take some control back, which does improve our ability to cope with the event. So, as with the previous points pertaining Solzhenitsyn, trying to make sense of what he did to end up in the gulag could be taken to be an attempt to regain a sense of control for this horribly traumatic situation. So even though it may seem counterintuitive that putting oneself as the cause for being put in a gulag is an effective coping strategy, that is kind of what the research says. Which brings me to a paper that Peterson cited in the Don't Compare Yourself to Other People rule. In that rule, he described this paper as a dismal, wretched, pessimistic philosophy where things are so terrible that only delusion can save you. Like the global meaning paper we were just talking about, this paper argues that positive illusions over how much control we actually have over our lives can actually help us cope with adversity thrown our way. If this video were an academic paper, all of these references we've been talking about, and some others, would just be part of a huge reference dump supporting an argument about an illusion or a perception of control being useful in helping us cope with a negative life event. But this video is in response to Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and Peterson himself called out that last paper as unreasonable and awful, so I'd like to draw a little bit of extra attention there. Peterson may not be explicitly saying that this is what Solzhenitsyn did in response to being put in the gulag, but from Peterson's description of things, it seems like a pretty good explanation for how Solzhenitsyn coped with being put through this traumatic experience. Solzhenitsyn further asked himself, according to Peterson, if he could stop making those same mistakes and maybe even fix the damage that he'd done previously.
He learned to watch and to listen. He took himself apart piece by piece, let what was unnecessary and harmful die, and resurrected himself.
So many biblical allusions here with Solzhenitsyn. It's striking. Sin, atonement, hell, resurrection. Maybe the second coming of Jesus will show up wearing an Adidas tracksuit. Finally, letting the harmful and unnecessary die. And finally, the reason comes out for why Peterson has been fanboying all over Solzhenitsyn for the past 2 pages.
Solzhenitsyn's writing utterly and finally demolished the intellectual credibility of communism as ideology or society. One man's decision to change his life instead of cursing fate shook the whole pathological system of communist tyranny to its core. It crumbled entirely not so many years later, and Solzhenitsyn's courage was not the least of the reasons why.
I wonder which Peterson despises more, Elmo or communism? Strange. Encyclopedia Britannica doesn't mention Solzhenitsyn anywhere in their Why Did the Soviet Union Collapse article. Snark aside, Solzhenitsyn was a Nobel Prize winner for literature. His writing was known. But he was exiled to West Germany and on the KGB watch list, so I doubt his writings really had much of an impact within the Soviet Union itself. So I guess the takeaway here is that because someone spoke out against the atrocities happening behind the Iron Curtain after surviving a Soviet gulag, we should have the ability to transform ourselves? Honestly, Solzhenitsyn was an incredibly strong person to be able to go through the gulag and then come out literally yelling about what he experienced in there, even knowing that he could meet the same fate or worse. But choosing to end this section with a jab at communism in a friggin' self-help book. It seems odd, but is honestly par for the course at this point. Peterson even goes so far as to compare Solzhenitsyn to Gandhi. Whole other bag of worms there, but okay. Okay, so life can be hard, but we don't have to turn into monsters because of it. How do we get to the actual setting our lives in order part? Guess you'll find out next week.